My name is Dennis A. Clegg. A stands for my father's first name, but my name is only A, middle name. And I was born in Heber, Utah, in June 27th on my parents' first wedding anniversary, June 27th, 1929.
So you just had a birthday.
Yeah, I was their first birthday. I was their first anniversary present or gift or whatever, I guess.
All right. Dennis, will you tell us a little bit about your ancestors and the family story, where they came from and how they got here?
Well, let me start with my dad's people. They were the Giles and Carlyles, and they came from England. And there were also the Cleggs on one line. My great great grandfather Henry Clegg was in Preston, England, when the prophet Joseph Smith sent missionaries from Kirtland, Ohio, where the church was, to England. The church was in trouble. There was a big depression in the United States in 1838, and Joseph Smith and the church had a bank that went broke, and a lot of people blamed him and left the church. So a lot of membership and leadership of the church disappeared. So the prophet called Heber C. Kimball, one of the apostles, to go to a mission in England, which he did, and arrived at Preston, England, about the center part of England. There he began to preach the gospel. And that's where my great-great-grandfather accepted the gospel and was baptized in the River Ribble, not far from the city of Preston, England. And they had a race. It was down lower than the hill above it, and they had a race. And Henry Clegg Sr. was in the race. But there was a man that got ahead of him who was much younger, and so my grandpa came in second. And it's a history in the family, but it's not much known because the second never gets any notoriety.
So can you tell us a little bit about when Henry...
Yeah, Henry Jr. came to America. He had married and had a wife and a baby. And he decided that the prophet was teaching people to come to America, because that's where the gospel is going to be promulgated from wherever the saints decided to settle, which of course eventually was Salt Lake City. And he made his way here with his wife, and on the trail, she was a frail woman, she died. And they had a little boy. And he buried her on the prairie, and shortly after that, the little boy died. So he picked him up in his arms and carried him clear back to his mother's grave and buried him with his mother. Then he walked back up and caught the main travelers and eventually got to Salt Lake City, where he met I think he'd been married by that time to a girl named Ann Lewis. And it's a little vague, but I think he helped care for her in his home. I'm not sure. There's several accounts of that. But then he married her polygamy was in vogue in those days, and he married her as a third wife. So he had two wives at the time, and the one had passed away. And he had homes for them in Heber City. The home she lived in is still there in Heber on First West, and we lived there till I was 7 years old after she passed away.
Dennis, what year did they travel across with it? Talk about the hand carts and a little bit about how they got there.
Yeah. Well, John Griffith was the father, of these two girls. Well, no, father of two girls and two boys. And the two boys died on the plains, and they were buried out near what we call, what's it called out there, Jonathan?
Martin's Cove.
Martin's Cove, right. And they both died on the trail. But Margaret Ann and her sister. Margaret Ann was 16 and her sister was 8 or 9. And they survived. In fact, they spent several nights in the open, laying down in the snow, till the rescuing party that Brigham Young had sent out. They got word that travelers coming by had found their problem, and they reported to Brigham Young, and he sent parties out to rescue them. And they arrived in Salt Lake City on December 1st, and the next day my grandpa died, John Griffiths. So there was two orphan girls, who finally made their way into different homes, and eventually, like I said, it's not completely clear. My grandmother, Margaret Ann, was eventually married to Henry Clegg, Jr. And by the way, the other one, what was her name? Sister.
Ann Lewis.
Oh yeah, no, the other girl, her sister. Oh dear. Anyway,
Margaret Ann?
she married a man whose son became a prize fighter, and when I was a child, he was famous as a lightweight prize fighter. What was his name?
Is it Margaret Ann?
No, Margaret Ann is the second wife.
Okay, and Ann
Yeah.
was,
Oh, it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be in this.
no.
But I used to pull out these names really fast, but they don't come to me sometimes now. Anyway, that's about it. And I was born 1 month before she died. She died in July. I don't have the exact date. And I was born in June, just about 4 weeks apart.
Dennis, can you talk about why they came to, or they started in Salt Lake City, but then they were asked to go other places, and I think you talked about Johnston's army.
Yeah, well, Utah became a territory, and the government sent out people to run the state, and they didn't like the Mormons, and there was a lot of falsehoods told about Mormons, and President Buchanan thought that our church was against the government, so he sent out these men to straighten everything out. Well, when Brigham Young got word of that, he told everybody to leave Salt Lake City. And my grandpa went to Springville, and he was there for quite a while. And after they cleared out all the mess that was happening from the invasion of the army into Salt Lake Valley, he had a brother named Jonathan, same as his name, who had found Heber Valley, and told him about it. So he gathered up his wife and wives, and they moved to Heber Valley, where he became a very prominent man in Heber. He was the bishop of one of the wards, and he organized choruses and choirs, and very prominent person. And he died in his little store that he has. He had a heart attack, and one day he was serving his people in his store and just had a heart attack and fell over. And he wasn't that old. I don't remember his age now. There's a lot of this I should have
No, you're good.
records with me, but I don't.
You're good. What was the name of the store? Was it some?
I think it was just Clegg's Market, or, well, they didn't use the word market in those days, but Clegg's store,
Grocery store.
grocery store, right.
say that he played some instruments?
He did. He played the dulcimer. I don't know what a dulcimer is, but it's a stringed instrument. In fact, I have his dulcimer. It's about that long, about this wide with strings, and you played it with a kind of a pick. I've never learned to play it, but it's called a dulcimer. And it was he apparently played that and sang a lot, like with the guitar. Only he held it flat. You didn't hold it up like the guitar, but it had more strings than the guitar. I don't know enough about it to know. I've never learned to play it.
And now tell us about your mother's side of the family.
Okay, my mother's side are technically not pioneers. Pioneers came before the railroad. If anyone came to Utah on the railroad after 1869, they're not called pioneers, but they're all pioneers after they got to Utah, I can tell you that, because Brigham Young sent them out to settle different. He planned where the cities were going to be, and he sent a lot of Scandinavians to Manti and Ephraim. And my ancestors were my grandfather came from Denmark. And my grandmother, his wife, came from Switzerland. She was Swiss-German. And their name was Stutzenegger. And they changed it to Stutzenegger, and I'm glad I got that name and the Clegg instead of Stutzenegger. And so they married in Manti. My mother was born in Manti in 04. That's 2004.
1904.
Yeah, 1904. And she graduated from school, high school, and her dad he had 12 children, and my dad wanted them all to find a way to make a living. So he made arrangements with the oldest sister, Aunt Emily, and Uncle Victor, to live with them and go to BYU, to the normal school, we called it in those days, which was training for women, or men, I don't think any men did it, I don't know, who became elementary school teachers. And so my mother became a teacher after 1 year, and she found a job in Horsehead, Utah, which is east of Monticello, right to the border of Colorado. And she was the only teacher, and she lived with a family who didn't have a bedroom for her, so they opened the daybed for her to sleep at night. And then the next morning she put all her stuff in a suitcase and put it under the daybed, and that's how she lived. And she walked a mile to the school to warm it up and start the stove, and taught several grades. I think she taught up to 8th grade. And she was so homesick she couldn't get home for Christmas. There was no way to get home for Christmas. To get to that place, she had to take a train to Provo, then on a train on the way to Colorado, and stop at a road that went south through Moab and down to Blanding. And she had no way to get home for Christmas, and she said she was so homesick she could hardly bear it. She'd never been away from home before. But she played the organ, so they had dances every Saturday night, and they danced to the organ that she played in this school. And her dad wrote her a letter, because they got mail back and forth, and said, "You be careful of those boys from Colorado. They're not members of the church." But I don't know if she danced with them or if she just played the organ all the time. But that's what they did for a little entertainment. But she was able to get a little better job the next year, and that was in Bluff, down near Blanding. And we took a tour with my mom and dad a few years back, and we visited all these places where she taught school. And we found out later that the place she lived in, there was her and then a man teacher who taught more grades. And they used to sit out in the hall and prepare their lessons. And it was it was a home that now was, or at least it was was owned by the famous writer. What's his name?
Louis L'Amour.
Yeah, Louis L'Amour. He's read most of Louis L'Amour books. But Louis wasn't there at the time. But the caretaker let us see his apartment, and she talked about how he taught school in Bluff. The next year she moved and got a place closer to her home in a little town called, it was a town that was settled by a group of Jewish colonists. There was some salesman that told this group of Jews back in the East who wanted to settle in the West, and he talked them into buying this place. And they built a little place and built homes, and it was out in, as Utah is, it was hard for them to understand how to live in this environment. No rain and so they tried to farm, but it didn't work out very well. And they soon all cashed in what they had and went back to New York. I forget where they came from. And so my mother didn't have that job, so the next year she got a job at Heber City. And it was there she met my dad. She taught the first and second grade for 1 year, and then they got married, and she was out of a job because they wouldn't let married women teach school back in those days. It's the law in Utah, maybe all in the country. I don't know why exactly. It was a long, long time before married women were allowed to teach school. So that brings you up to both of my parents pretty well.
Was that pretty unusual for a female teacher to go traveling all these different towns back then?
I'm sure it was, but my grandpa, her dad, was very determined that his children would have a place in the world. They weren't left to run around and find life on their own. He was quite capable of finding ways for his children to make it in the world. She was in the middle of 12 children.
So Dennis, you were born 1928.
1929 on their first wedding anniversary, yeah.
And
we lived in my grandma's house for the first till I was 7 years old. My grandma Margaret Ann's house. They had no water in it. Even when we lived there, we had a dipper and a bucket full of water. We had to go out. There's one of those pump hydrants, and we kept that full. And we all drank out of the same dipper. Back in those days, cleanliness wasn't known, hygiene wasn't known like it is now. So I got all of the childhood diseases that were going around while we lived there. I got whooping cough, scarlet fever, chicken pox. That's why I've had, what's the disease called? It was a result of chicken pox.
Shingles.
Shingles, yeah, I've had shingles once. I hope I don't get them again. And I lived there until I was 7. And the school was, we didn't have kindergarten in those days, and then we went to school at 6 years of age. And the school was a block and a half away from where I lived. But my mother had 2 children, babies to take care of in the meantime. Twin boys and a daughter. And that my dad was working at the grocery store. So neither one of them could take me to school the day it started. So my grandma said, she pointed the way and said, head for that building up there and ask somebody where you start first grade. So that's what I did. I went by myself. My teacher was Miss Eschler. I now know that's a German name, Ischla, in German. She was a good teacher, and I was a pretty good student. I learned to read pretty fast. Then I went to, that was called the Central School. It's now where the police force is on that block. It's been torn down, the building. And I can remember each teacher. My 5th grade teacher was interesting. I think, looking back at it, I think he was lazy. He'd teach us thing in the morning, and in the afternoon he'd read us books all the rest of the day. I think he was too lazy to prepare, but I don't know exactly. Because I remember he threw a racer. I don't know if it was me or the kid in front of me, but it hit the kid in front of me. I remember that. He'd be fired for that nowadays if he tried to do something like that.
Do you remember any of the books that you read to?
Well, we read books about... I read books on my own. The library was only a block and a half away. And I read all the X-Bar X boys. And I read a book about Alaska. Was it Jack London that wrote? I read his book about Alaska and the far north, and a dog. That was a fascinating story. And I had a story I remember about a horse and a boy that wanted to get in the circus so he could get to this pony. But I don't remember. And I read a lot of other kind of books. I read a lot. Nothing very serious. My wife read all the classics when she was a girl. I just read fun books.
Dennis, where was your house located where you grew up, and is it still there?
It is. It was.
Start with.
It was the house I lived in was my grandma Margaret Ann Griffith's home, and it was on the corner from what is now the football field. No, it was
Park.
It's the city park. It's hard for me to put. It's the city park, and it was on the south west corner of the city park, across the street from the city park. And it's still there. It's had some changes on it since I lived there.
That was till you were 7. Talk about it.
Right, we lived there till I was 7, and then there's another story if you have time for it. My dad wanted a different place. He wanted to live down where he grew up. I guess he wanted to. That's what he did. So he found out that the school was selling one of the houses that was on the school grounds. You know where the school grounds offices are in Heber?
The North School.
They're on the old North School. Well, there was an old log house there, and they wanted to sell it because they needed all that space. And so my dad put in a bid for it. I can't remember, but I think it was $500, which was a lot of money then. But he had to move it. He had to agree to move it. So we got Ketchum's company to agree to come and move it. And after they come up and checked it out, they backed out. They wouldn't do it. So my dad was stuck with the $500 house and don't know what to do with it. Then one day the superintendent of the county, who was over the roads, got talking, and he said, "Well, I think we can do something for you. We'll put it under logs and we'll drag it down there." And that's what they did. And they drug it down, and in the meantime, Dad and my Uncle Elmo Clegg had made a foundation with sandstone that they got from way up east of Heber. And I remember it going by while I was still living in Grandma Margaret Ann's house. And there was a caterpillar just pulling it, dragging it on logs. Well, you couldn't do that today. There were not, of course, the roads were not asphalt; they were dirt or gravel. But that's where they did it, and they set it down, and they took it in 2 parts. Our living room always was a little bit sloping when they put those 2 together, and that's where we lived after that.
Where was the house moved to? What location?
363 West and 2nd South, and it's still there. We sold it some time ago after my mother and dad passed away. And it was my job. I was the oldest, so it was my job to do a lot of the chores that kids later did. And it was my job after I got home from school, after I listened to the Lone Ranger on the radio, to bring in wood and coal and kindling. I had to chop some kindling and take it in a bucket and put small pieces of coal for the kitchen stove and put big lumps of coal for the heaterola in the living room, and that's how we heated all the house, which wasn't heated. It was cold in the winter upstairs. We froze to death. It was cold. And that's where I lived till graduated from high school. And those were interesting days.
Dennis, where?
My dad lost his job because he woke me up in the middle of the night about 1936, I think it was. Said, "Come on, there's a fire. I want you to go see it." And we got up there, and it was the Hebrew Mercantile where he worked, and it burned to the ground. So he was out of a job. So he knew about groceries price or sources, so he got a little panel truck and drove to Salt Lake to Scowcroft's, I can remember their name. There he got some groceries, and he decided to go peddle them out in Daniels, because most people in Daniels didn't have a car. They couldn't get to Heber, a lot of them, especially a lot of the old widows that lived out there. And so all one summer, and I can't remember, it's another summer, me and my brother, who was 3 years younger than me, we went with him, and we'd go to the doors and ask people if they wanted to buy some groceries. And that's what we did. And people in the neighborhood discovered we had groceries in the house. So they started coming over and asking if they could buy some of his groceries. So he turned it into a neighborhood grocery store. And we had that for about 7 years. And
Dennis, you grew up in the Depression. Do you want to talk a little bit about
well,
what
the
Heber was?
Depression was a hard time. But I didn't know it. Everybody was poor like we were. Everybody. We were all poor. And we had neighbors that were poorer than us. And we survived. And there was government assistance that people wanted to get onto. And my dad wouldn't take government assistance. He didn't believe in that. So that's what he did to make a living for us. In the meantime, my grandma, who was still alive, was willing when he asked if he could buy part of their farm. They had a 10-acre farm that was east of Heber. And so he did, and that's where we started farming. Then he bought another 10-acre piece right next to it. And so we farmed all of the years I grew up with horses, a team of horses. There were no tractors when I was a little boy. Eventually there were tractors that came. But my dad never bought one until I'd left home a long time and married, but then I used to go help him haul his hay. And I didn't know it was hard times. That's the way it was. Everybody was poor. There was one or two people in town that were rich. One of them was the guy that had a service station, and he sold refrigerators and appliances. We thought he was rich, but he just had more than the rest of us, and that's about what it was. Well, the Depression was a hard time, but we didn't know it was a hard time. We were born in that, and that's the way life was. And everybody we knew in our neighborhood was as bad off as we were, and some of them worse. At least Dad had an income until the store burned down. And then we had a cow and chickens and pigs, and so we raised a lot of our own food, and we raised a garden. It was my job to go up around the block to get the water and flood it down and get it to the garden, and it was my job to weed and water the garden. And we raised peas and corn and all kinds of vegetables, and my mother canned fruit and vegetables. And that's another story. I'm going two directions here. I had one pair of shoes during the Depression. And we had a cow, so I had to help take care of the cow so I could get manure on my shoes. So every Saturday night, after our Saturday night bath, I'd have to clean the manure off my shoes to get to go to church the next day. And that bath is another thing. We had a double galvanized tub, and who's ever got, my mother took turns. And if you were first, you got the clean water. If you were last, you got the dirty water. And that's the way it worked. And we got a bath once a week, as the old saying is, whether we needed it or not. of course, we needed it. And those were hard times in a way, but it was just the way it was. Lots of people's homes were very similar in trying to maintain their homes, and we always close up to the sitting close to the stoves to keep warm, because these were not insulated homes, and they had a lot of breeze coming through, and they were not well built, and so the cold parts around the edges were cold. So if you get up close to the stove, you get a little heat. And that's the way we survived the winters.
Do you want to say anything about your high school days?
Well, I went to 6th grade in the central schools. I've already mentioned that. And then I went to the high school from 7th to 12th grade. And we didn't know the difference between junior high and senior high. They were all one big building, and some teachers taught a 7th grade class one period, and the next period they might be teaching a senior class. It was all one big organization. We weren't separated into junior and senior high, and I probably never heard of those names till lots of years after that. But we had some good teachers, and my dad went to that same school. It was built first in 1912, and it was made of pot rock, no doubt come from Midway. And in 1928, they added on a section, and it was a brick part. So the high school had two sections, and there was a big breezeway in between the two, and not a breezeway, but connected by halls and large windows between the two buildings. And you could go from one to the other. And if you had a class at the top of one building and had to get to the other one on the bottom, you only had 5 minutes to get there. So we had to run to our lockers and hurry before we often were late to our classes. And that's the way it worked. And so I graduated in 1947, and that was where my dad had gone to school. Well, he didn't go to the new part, the brick part. He only went to the pot rock part, but he did graduate in a day when many men did not graduate from high school. More girls did, I guess, than men, but a lot of them went out and got jobs. And after school, he graduated, got a job at the mines, the Park City mines. For many years, I'd guess way over 50% of the men in Heber worked at the Park City mines. That was a major source of income for lots of people.
Do you remember what they were mining there back then?
Well, they got gold and silver as a side, but the mining was, it wasn't coal. It was, good question. I had an uncle that worked in the shop that kept the tools sharp, and the axes and the picks, because it was all hand done, no machinery. And he worked every day and sharpened they had a forge. You know what a forge is? Yeah. And they had to keep the axes and the picks, because it was all hand done, this mining. They had to keep them all sharpened. That was a job he had that worked there every day. What is it? The ore was sent to smelters in South Salt Lake. What's the name?
Gold, silver, and lead.
That's right, gold, silver, and lead. Yeah, that's right. Okay. And the ore was hauled by railroad to the smelters south of Salt Lake. I watch every time I go to Salt Lake to see the old road. You can see it up on the hillside where the railroad was. Unless you know where it is, nobody ever look at it. But I remember where it was.
Where was the high school that you went to school at then?
Where was high school? What?
That your dad and you went to school?
Well, it was the pot rock part that was described to you.
On the city
Oh, it was on the city block. Yeah, what's now the city block, and it was the south end of it. And the north end of it was this new part. New, 1928, which was brick. That's the part I went to. Well, I had classes in both of them. when I finally graduated. And in the winter, the park was also the football field for the high school teams. And in the winter, because we always had big winters then, they'd pile snow all over it and flood it, and we'd have an ice skating rink. I used to go there and go ice skating. And I finally got some shoe skates for Christmas, because they had the kind that had to turn and keep on the soles of your shoes. And they were hard to get on, but then they come out with shoe skates. And I got a pair for Christmas. Used to go out and we could go up and go skating anytime we wanted. It was free. And I know we used to have some class parties there. When I started dating my wife, Georgia Dawn, we had a party from our seminary. That's our church schooling. And her dad brought her over. They didn't have a car. They had an old cattle truck because he hauled cattle to the market in stockyards in Salt Lake. But she wanted to be there because we were getting pretty friendly together. And so he brought her over in his truck. And she sat on the sideline and watched me skate, and I'd go over and sit by her, and some of the other people every once in a while. That was one of the things that we used to do when we first started dating. And we finally both graduated in 1947, and there were quite a few kids that were sweethearts. And most of them got married right after school. But we didn't. We both wanted to go on missions for the church, so we did. We got married after our missions. And that's when I started going to BYU, and I enrolled in the new Air Force ROTC at BYU, and took all the classes that were needed. And finally, when I got through most of the course, they sent me to Hillfield for a physical. And they rejected me because my eyes weren't good enough to be a pilot. And I wondered since then, why did they wait that long and then finally get rid of me? So the draft board got word of that, and I was sent and drafted into the Army and sent to San Luis Obispo, California, which is a place where you join the Signal Corps. So I was sent to the Signal Corps. And I was trained to be a teletype operator. And even though our unit was supposed to go to Korea, at least all the ones in our graduating class, we're told we're going to be sent to Korea, because that was during the Korean War. And there was about 10 or 12 of us that were sent to Germany instead, because we were operating. That's not the right word I want. Germany was divided into conquering areas. In the north was the English area. In the west was a small part of the French, because the French didn't do much to win the war, but they got a part of it. And in the south was the American zone. And in the east was the Russian zone, and you've heard about that. And so we could never go there. When I was there, they had the Iron Curtain down, and that's another story. I won't go into that. But I was sent to Heidelberg, Germany, and worked in a comm center. And there was a bunch of other LDS boys, and we all got together and asked the Captain Brown, if we could bring our wives over. And he was a nice guy, and he said, well, I guess. I don't know if he'd had that request before, but he said, as long as you find a place to live, you're on your own. The Army won't furnish it for you. And you've got to be near a telephone. In case of attack from Russia, we got to call you immediately. So I had a friend that was there then, from Heber, Kendall Cowley was his name, and he was married, and he had his wife there, and he helped me find a place to live, which you wouldn't call a place right now. I'll mention that later. So I wrote to my sweetheart, and she said, oh yeah, I want to come. And her dad said, don't go, I don't want you to go that far away, because her mother was dead, and she was taking care of the home. but she wanted to come. We were newlyweds, and we wanted to be together, and so we wrote back, and she arranged to be with a bunch of LDS missionaries, and they all came together on this USS United States. You didn't travel by plane in those days. That was military. So we agreed that she would land on a certain day and that she would come to the mission home for the church. And so it was all set up, and I got leave for that day and went up and stayed at the mission home overnight. And the next morning I thought, well, why am I waiting for her to come down here? Why don't I go up and meet the boat? Which I did. And I'd never seen anybody so relieved in all my life as she was. There she was, out of money, which I won't tell all the circumstances. And she didn't know any German. She didn't know what to do. There, she got off the boat. She could see me standing there. And she said the most wonderful time she ever had when she needed somebody. So we got together, and I knew all the ways to travel. And we traveled to where I had my home in Wiebingen, a little town between Seckenheim, where our unit was, and Heidelberg. And we had they had a room with the bed on about that wide. We slept together on this little narrow bed. And after a while, we found a place in Heidelberg from some LDS friends that had found a place, which was a little nicer. We were on the third floor of a house, and the man was a policeman, and his wife was a doctor, Frau Doktor. And there was a law in Germany at that time that if you had any room you weren't using, you had to rent it out. Housing was very short from World War II. So we finally moved into that house. We had a bed a little bit wider. And we were on the third floor, and we had no water, and we had to carry our water up and down to do cooking and drinking from their bottom floor. But so we lived together there till I finally was sent home and released in, can't remember the name of the place now, in the eastern part of New York. And we flew home, and we started building a house. The house I live in now, I built pretty much myself. I was too stupid to know I couldn't, because I grew up on a farm and we did everything our own way. So my wife's brother had some training in mechanics and carpentry. And he helped me get started on this, and he had a little old tractor, Caterpillar, that he made by himself, putting together parts. And he dug a hole for me. What he did is he scraped what dirt there was off the pot rock. So I poured he had a little electric cement mixer he loaned me, and I got my brothers together and we poured the footings. Then after that I had worked for a cement contractor as a teenager, and I knew how to build forms. So I built forms, got the lumber and wiring, and built some pieces that were the width of the foundation, 8 or 10 inches, can't remember now. And you had to put it between these, and I'd have to help one of my brothers hold it up, and then they had to twist the tire and the wire and get it, and then we poured half of the foundation, and then when it dried up, I took the wood all apart and took it on the other half, and that's how we poured the foundation to my house. And then I built all the forms, the lumber for the footing for the floor. Can't remember names of all the things now. Sometimes I'm under a little pressure and it won't come to me. So, but anyway, I did most of the building myself, except when I couldn't do some of it myself, so my dad would help me, or Max would come and help me. And there were no, what do you call them, buildings?
Building codes?
No, there were, well, yeah, there were no codes in those days. You could do it the way you wanted, but there are no ways to build a roof. Like, what do we call them now?
Roof trusses.
Oh, yeah, there were no trusses in those days. So I had to get my dad to help me and I had the boards all cut and measured, and that was a job. And on one end we put two of them like that, and then we had another board to tack and hold them together, and then we'd do it then do that on the other side, and then we'd put the boards connecting the two. It was a lot of work those days. Now they do it with cranes. They can have a truss put in an hour or less on a house, and it took me days to build a roof. But that's the way we did it in those days. Now, I've told you all I know.
Dennis, so you had how many siblings? You're okay?
Do you break that or a drink or anything like that?
Yeah,
How many
I got
what?
some water, I'm sorry. There is water in the hall, but next time I've got to buy water.
Do you need a drink?
Yeah, that would be nice. Yeah, it was a different world then than it is now.
So Dennis, when we get ready again, now your wife was, what's her name again, her full name?
Georgia Dawn Johnson.
Okay, mention that, so we get all her name in there.
Okay.
And then she was already from Midway, right? She was
She
from.
was born and raised in Midway.
So a little bit about that. And I know the house that was next to yours was their house, right? An
Yes, that's where she grew up.
Adobe building, yeah.
Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit more when
Okay, when we're ready.
he gets back.
And you had 6 siblings, right?
I did. Well, 5. There were 6 of us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll ask you about that. No water,
I
huh?
don't know how to bring you drink down there, no cups.
Okay, I'm okay. I'll make it.
I have my water thing, but I've already drank it. Unless you want to go
Tell
back
me when
to where
you're
you shared
ready.
the same
Okay,
thing. Next time I will remember.
go ahead and look over it, Athena, so I can get a focus on you.
We should be almost done, but.
You ready?
that would be
Start.
nice. Yeah, so you built your house is where you left off. there,
Yeah,
the Trestles.
We had a house there, you wouldn't remember, but we tore it down 2 years ago. It got so expensive to maintain that we just couldn't take care of it, so it's turned into a big lawn now. But I own the lot. And I get kids riding out there on their motorcycles sometimes, and so I have to kind of tell them this is mine. It looks like it's part of the subdivision, but it is not. It was my wife's father's home area, and we just couldn't maintain the house anymore. So we had it torn down.
Now, you had 5 siblings, and you had told me last time that you
Yeah,
kind of outlived almost all of them, right? Go ahead and talk a little
I was
bit
the
about
firstborn, as you know. And then the next one was 3 years later was my brother Vern. And then there were twin boys, Alman and Calvin. And then a sister, Aline, who's still alive. And a brother, LeVar, who's passed away. 3 brothers that have passed away, and there's 3 of us left.
that. You had quite a successful run at the school district. Tell us, what did you like about teaching, and what did you teach? A little bit of that.
Well, I was going to be a band teacher because I played the trumpet all through band in high school and college. But I couldn't afford the private lessons you had to take because you had to learn all the instruments. You couldn't teach band if you couldn't teach a kid how to play a saxophone or a trumpet or whatever. You had to know how to play all of the instruments, as well as there are a lot of things about them. So one day while we were in Germany, we went to visit a cathedral called Worms. It's worms in our word, but they're not the same thing. And we went there because that's where Martin Luther stood. And so we walked up to see on the pulpit, and there was a big circle. And it said that this is where Martin Luther stood and said, "I will not recant." the Catholic Church threatened to excommunicate him if he did not recant, which meant take back. And he wouldn't. And that started, and he was excommunicated from the Catholic Church, and that thank you. And that started the Protestant Reformation, yeah. So I got interested in history, especially European history, because there's lots of history, and that's where almost all Americans' ancestors come, is from Europe, Western Europe. So I decided to major in that field. Unfortunately, many of the classes I took for the, the BYU program, what's it called? Anyway, I took were classes in political history of European to meet the demands of the. I just told you a little while ago what it was, and so I had a lot of credits already that I could transfer to a history major. So that's what I did. ROTC. Yeah, I took a lot of classes for ROTC. Right now I can remember Ukraine. We studied the Ukraine, and it was called the breadbasket of Europe. And so I'm quite interested in what's happening in the Ukraine, because I studied some history of the Ukraine as part of my training, my major in history. So that's what happened, and I did graduate in history, and my minor was geography. And the very same year I applied for a job to teach in the Wasatch district, they required geography as a class in the 9th grade. And there I was, right there for them. They didn't have anybody that had a degree in geography. So they gave me a job right away, and I started teaching world history and geography. And I also had a degree in Utah history and U.S. history. So I taught all of those classes at one time or another. The last few years I taught mostly geography. And the nations of the world all changed names. All the African names got their freedom. They had to learn new names. And I don't remember the names of some of those even now until I get a map out. But that's what I taught for 34 years.
Did you teach any of your family members?
Yeah, I taught him. He was one of my students. And I taught
Your son.
all of my children. I taught Keith, he's older. And I taught Carol Dawn, daughter, and then Janine. And I taught my brother LeVar. And that was interesting, but fortunately they were all well behaved and I didn't have any discipline problems. I don't know how they had, what they think about it or not, but yeah, that was interesting. I didn't know I was going to do that when I decided to be a teacher.
How many schools did you teach at?
I taught at that school we talked about. That was the old pot rock and brick one where my dad went to school, where I went to school, and then they created a new school out south of town, high school, and I taught there. And then they built a junior high, and then I taught in the junior high for a few years, and that was it. So that was about 3 or 4 different buildings. The day that we moved from the old buildings to the new buildings, they asked us to have our kids pick up their chairs and carry them 2 blocks to the new school, and that's how we got to. Were you part of that?
I was.
Yeah. So that's how we moved. I thought that was a pretty cheap way for the district to get their equipment moved from one school to another.
Dennis, can you mentioned a little bit about your wife and her name and how you continued her name throughout the generations. So you start off with your wife and then
Well, her name was Georgia Dawn, named after her dad, George. And Dawn, for two reasons. Her mother used to read a book about a girl named Dawn, and she was born in the dawn. So it's a D-A-W-N, Dawn. And so that's why, I'm sure it was her mother that chose that name. I don't know how they agreed on Georgia after her dad, but that's what it was. And her mother died when she was only 59 years old. And her daughter, Georgia Dawn, was a big part of keeping the family together and taking care of it even while she went to school. Now, I don't know how she ever grew up. The house they lived in had one bedroom. And the kids, there were two girls and two boys. And somehow they lived on mats or whatever. They didn't have a bedroom. And here's two girls and two boys, and they had an outhouse. They didn't have a bathroom. I don't know how in the world they ever grew up, but I remember she always came to church or school clean. She had beautiful blonde hair. And that's when I fell for her. It took me quite a while to get courage to date her. And in our church, we don't date till we're 16. At least that's what we're usually told to do. So in the junior year, I got courage to ask her for a date. And I didn't have a car. Dad had an old pickup truck that he used on the farm. And they were not pretty pickup trucks like they are nowadays. And nobody drove a pickup truck with their girlfriend in those days. So I asked her if she'd go out with me. She thought about it and said, yeah. I said, well, now I have a problem. I don't know how to get you to the show. I asked if we could go to a movie theater. She gave it some thought, and she said, later on, I guess later on, I guess she'd ask her dad. So she found out that if she got there the night before, in her dad's old truck, she could stay at her aunt's house. And I'd walk up and pick her up in her aunt's house, which was about 4 or 5 blocks from the movie theater. And we did, and we went to Ad Everett's, which is a confectioner, and we had nut sundaes for a quarter. So the date cost me about $1, 2 nut sundaes and 2 movie tickets. And I walked her home, and she stayed that night at her aunt's home. And I guess her dad came and got her the next day in this old great big cattle truck. So that's a little bit of what life was like in those days. And eventually I bought an old 1930 Chevrolet. And I started dating her in that car. And one time we drove up the canyon right up here. And there was a stream that you went through with a lot of rocks in it. And I guess it didn't have very good tires because I went through the stream and popped a tire. I can't remember if I did not have a spare or whether I didn't have any tools to do it. But anyway, we walked clear back from there to her dad's house. And her brother Max owned a Jeep. And he came up in the Jeep and changed the tire for us and got us back home. And that's kind of some of the things we did. We had a lot of fun dating. And we just did a lot of different things. And he used to take us for rides in his Jeep over all these mountains here. I always thought, I'd sure like to get a Jeep, and we could go travel all over those mountains. But I never could afford them. Lots of people owned Jeeps that were used from World War II. And you could buy used ones. But I was just a little old guy that worked 40 cents an hour at a grocery store after school. I earned $1 a day that way. An hour and a half working. And then on Saturdays, I'd work 8 hours, and so I'd earn $4. Anyway, money was pretty tight in those days. And 40 cents was not much. It was poor wages even then, but you couldn't find jobs. Kids couldn't find jobs. There were no fast foods and things like that for kids to get jobs that like there are now. So I was lucky to get a job working at this department store, which is the old Heber Exchange, and it had 3 departments. It had the grocery department, which I worked for, and it had a hardware, and then it had what they called the dry goods, which was clothes. It had 3 different sections. And after we graduated, I worked for them with their delivery man. They delivered groceries, and that's a thing that's come back again already. And I delivered groceries because the next summer I got a chauffeur's license, and so I was their delivery man. They'd call in orders, and I'd go get a bunch of them and deliver them all over to their homes and collect the money and do that all day for us all summer, that next summer after I graduated from high school. And we couldn't go on missions till we were 20 in those days. So I worked another year for the Forest Service. And we camped out for 2 weeks and built fences. And we slept in tents that they had set up for us up in the mountains east of Heber. And the first day I got out there, there was a little white building. You could see it as you drove up Daniels Canyon up toward Strawberry, but I think it's there anymore. Anyway, there were 2 guys that worked there, and I was assigned to them. And the first morning they said, "Okay, you're the cook." Well, I'm the cook, yeah. I guess they were tired of cooking. Yeah, you're the cook. I can't remember what I did, but I fixed up something, and they didn't complain. And then we'd go out and fix fences, walking. We get home to our tent at night and go to sleep, and next morning get up early and walk out and fix some more fences. Because that's when, that was in the days when you could buy cattle permits and send them out in the mountains. My dad had a cattle permit for 2 cattle, and every spring we'd haul them out and put them in the mountain entrance to the center canyon. And then there was a cattlemen's association that would go gather them all up and bring them in the fall. One year I had one that Dad gave me, and it never come back, so I never did ever see it. I guess they lost some once in a while, but both of the ones Dad had came back, but mine never did, so I lost my cattle.